Good morning, everyone. So we're going to get started in about 5 more minutes. So if you could, if you're interested, grab yourself something to eat and something to drink and get settled in, and we can get things underway. Okay, good morning, everyone. We're going to get started. Thank you so much for coming out on this beautiful Wednesday morning. This is the warmest day we've had in a few months. I know it's quite tempting for some of us to play hooky and go out and hang out in the park all day, but we have obligations and also interests, and we hope today's forum will really be insightful for you and also provide some sense of where the city has been with respect to food policy over the last 10 years and where the city's going. So that's a bit of background. I'm Craig Willingham. I'm the Deputy Director for the CUNY Urban Food Policy Institute. We're a research and action center focused on identifying evidence to solve urban food problems. And when we talk about urban food problems, we really mean a wide array of issues, everything from food waste to urban agriculture to food security, upstate, downstate linkages, and focuses on a sort of labor of love and hate because of the amount of work that went into it. A report we've been working on for some time, looking at food policy in New York City over the last 10 years, and what are the sorts of achievements that have been made, where are we currently at, and what are the sort of indications for the future. And as part of that review, we looked at a wide range of data sources and really tried to capture this unruly beast of food policy and get a snapshot of what's actually been taking place. And as part of that, the report was broken into two different pieces, a long version for those of you who really want to get deep into the nitty-gritty, and a shorter version, which is still pretty substantial, but is obviously a shorter read. So it went out yesterday in our newsletter. It's also available on our website under publications, both the long, short version and the appendix. So I highly recommend you checking it out. And for those of you who attended the last forum that we had on food policy in New York over the last 10 years, focusing on governance, this document, the new document, is a companion to that and really sort of gets into the specifics of what happened as opposed to the sort of mechanisms by which it takes place. And as part of today's forum, my boss, Dr. Nick Freudenberg, is going to give a short talk on some of our findings in the report and tee us up for the panel, which I think is a really exciting lineup, and I think will provide you with some great insight on food policy in New York City and beyond. So, Nick, if you could come up.
Good morning. Thank you all so much for coming. It's a pleasure to have you all here, and we're very excited, as Craig said, having worked on this for many months, to be able to share it with you. And we hope that today is the beginning of a discussion about where do we go from here. What do we hope to achieve in food policy over the next 5 to 10 years? And this report that we're talking about was co-authored by several of us at the Food Policy Institute, Nevin Cohn, who's somewhere in the room right here, Craig, myself, and our colleague Jan Poppendiek, who couldn't be here today. Craig mentioned that we put out several different versions of this report. I call them the Papa Bear, the Mama Bear, and the Baby Bear report. The Baby Bear report is the executive summary. It's about 6 pages, and for people who have the millennial attention span, you can read through it in 10 minutes or less. The Mama Bear report, will take you 45 minutes or so, and the Papa Bear report is for nerds, who are willing to wade through 50 pages. But we really encourage people to read it because it provides the details of the data that we looked at. So these are the 4 questions that we sought to answer in our report. We wanted to look at the recommendations that have been made in food policy over the last 10 years. We wanted to summarize and look at the contributions and the limitations of the food metrics report, which were mandated by the City Council in 2011 and have been produced since 2012. We then looked at a wider set of food policies that have been implemented, and some data is available on their implementation and some of them on their impact. And then finally, we looked at some outcome data on some measures that are documented in the Community Health Survey and some other reports. We divided, if you look on, I guess it's your, this side, I have trouble with right from left, we divided the recommendations and the goals into 6 broad policy goals: to improve nutritional well-being, to promote food security, policies to create food systems that support economic and community development. Number 4 was to ensure a sustainable municipal and regional food system. Number 5 was to support food workers. And number 6 was to strengthen food governance and food democracy. And we thought by breaking out those goals, and many of the policies contribute to several of these goals, we would get a more comprehensive understanding of what was going on in food policy in New York City. And as Craig mentioned, we looked at 4 different sources of data. We looked at the 20 government reports put out by city and state officials between 2008 and 2017. We looked at the food metrics reports from 2012 to 2017, and then this, what we call the top 40 food policies. And then the health outcomes we looked at were fruit and vegetable consumption, obesity, diabetes, food security, food insecurity, and soda consumption, sugary beverage consumption. And that was to get some sense of how does this panoply of policies that we looked at contribute to it. Each of these sources of data and each of our methods for analyzing these data has limitations. We used only publicly available data for this report, and we had to make some assumptions, and some of them we'll talk about today. And some of you, in reading those assumptions, will maybe have different opinions. But we do believe this is the most comprehensive look at food policy in New York City in the last period yet to be published. And we hope that it inspires other deeper, more in-depth looks at what's been happening. These are some of the 20 city and state reports that we looked at in the first data source. Some of these were put out by the mayor and the governor, others were put out by city council and state legislators. And what did we learn from this review? First, in the last decade, our elected officials in the city and state, in both the executive and the legislative branches, have taken up food policy, creating new opportunities to advance a more comprehensive look at our food system. And I think the message we want to emphasize is New York has accomplished so much in food policy. We're going to focus a lot on the limitations in my talk and in the discussion, but we've accomplished so much, and we really ought to celebrate our collective successes in doing that. Second, there's a rich array of policy ideas on the table. Our review of these 20 reports identified 420 separate recommendations made over the last 10 years. So New York City's problem is not lacking good ideas for food policy. In fact, it's having too many ideas on the table and not having priorities and not having a framework for making decisions. And third, we believe the lack of attention to food policy governance constitutes a long-run liability, and developing new approaches to governance that include more voices, develop methods for setting priorities, and pay more attention to monitoring and assessment are important for achieving better outcomes. And we reject the view that the way it is the only way it can be. We're celebrating our successes but pointing out our problems because we believe together we can do better. This comes from our look across the 3 sources of data, the 20 government reports, the food metrics, and we looked at the breakdown, I'm sorry if this is a little hard to read, about what of these 6 broad goals got the most attention. And what we found the most attention to was promoting nutrition. And that's appropriate. That's an important goal and a place where certainly the city has a lot of mandates and authority and resources. We found much less attention on food workers and the rights and needs of food workers and on food governance and democracy. And we believe that paying more attention to those 2 policy goals in the next 5 to 10 years will help us to move the whole shebang forward. We also made some recommendations about the food metrics reports. And those include, and I'll just highlight them and maybe in the discussion period, or if you have a chance to look at the report, you can see some of the details. We think the food metrics reports should include denominators as well as numerators. It's not enough to know how many school lunches are served. You need to know what proportion of enrolled students are actually getting those lunches. It's not enough to know how many acres of farmland upstate are preserved. We need to know how much farmland exists and what proportion was saved. And without denominators, it's hard to track progress. Second, we need to select additional indicators that give a wider view than what the food metrics report looks at, which was mandated by the City Council in 2011, and then a few new indicators on food security were added in 2013. So it's time for what we call a food metrics 2.0 to think about some other indicators. And the city already collects a lot of data on food that isn't in food metrics. And we think it's time to think about how to put all that data together and make it available both to public officials but also to advocates and community leaders. We think more constituencies inside and outside city government should be involved in the metrics process. We think there should be a sharper focus on equity. The de Blasio administration has highlighted equity overall. We think the food metrics report should be tracking our progress in all the indicators in reducing the really unconscionable racial, ethnic, socioeconomic inequalities in food access and food outcomes. And we think the metrics report should focus on outcomes as well as implementation. That's more challenging, we understand that, but that's the only way we can monitor progress. So we looked at the, what we call the top 40 food policies, and I'll tell you some of our conclusions from one of the 6 categories. The first one, which is improving nutrition. And we identified 15 policies out of the top 40 in this category, the largest group. And among the accomplishments were that they improved access to healthy food in low-income communities, healthy bodegas and Shop Healthy, fresh, green carts. They improved the quality and healthfulness of the city's institutional food programs, salad bar, water jets, food standards, garden to cafe, grow to learn, fruit and vegetable prescription programs, and they discourage consumption of unhealthy food, sugary drinks, salt, trans fats. A number of city agencies were involved, included educational campaigns, and I think they really illustrate how city agencies, the city council and the mayor can work together to improve food environments. All 15 of the policies we looked at report some data on implementation, and 10 of the 15 have some data on impact. But generally, the evaluation studies are modest and not very rigorous. On the one hand, these limitations point to the challenges of transforming food environments and reversing the many diet-related health conditions, and the difficulty of evaluating impact. On the other hand, they point to the power of city and state government to change food environments. And we think perhaps the most important accomplishment of the last decade is showing that that can be done, that city government can take it on and bring about changes. But unfortunately, as I'll describe in a moment, we believe that the changes actually influenced haven't been sufficient to reverse the many problems that have developed over the last few decades. So let's look at some of those outcomes. This is daily fruit and vegetable consumption, and you can see that most New Yorkers consume 1 to 4 portions of fruit and vegetables a day, a rate that has not changed in 10 years. About 10% report no consumption of fruits and vegetables, and about 10% meet the now larger CDC recommendation for 5 or more portions a day. This one shows some of the successes of the last decade. A reduction in daily consumption of 1 or more sugary drinks a day. And again, this is something to celebrate. However, there's still sharp racial and ethnic disparities. Here you see the same data for children 6 to 12, and you can see there are reductions over the period 2009 to 2015, but the reductions were largest among white children and smallest among Black and Latino children. So those inequalities persist. To my mind, this is the most disturbing image of the morning. It shows that about 60% of New York City adults are overweight and obese, and the rate has not changed much in the last decade. These trends ensure that another generation of preventable deaths and illnesses from diabetes, heart disease, cancer, and other diet-related diseases await New York City. And if we're sitting here 5 to 10 years from now and these charts look the same, we will have failed in our public health mission. So we're very determined that together we figure out how to turn some of these numbers around over the next few years. And for high school students in New York City, the findings on obesity and overweight are about the same. Not surprisingly, given the persistence of adult obesity, the reports of diagnosed cases of diabetes have increased in the last decade. And diabetes is a leading cause of the inequalities in death rates, premature death rates in New York City. And food insecurity, some good news. Between 2014 and 2015, the last year for which estimates are available, the number of food insecure New Yorkers decreased by about 120,000 people, probably as a result of improvements in the economy and perhaps better access to food benefits. Again, an important progress and victory. But if all the parts of the tax plan and the budget proposed by Trump and Congress go forth, we might see food insecurity increase and the safety net programs that address that decrease. And I think we all recognize that here we live in the richest city, in the richest country in the world. And why do we still have any food insecurity? It is within the power of New York City to virtually eliminate food insecurity. And we've accepted it as a given part of our environment. So I want to close with our recommendations. And we make 6 recommendations, and I want to just say a word or two about each. Our deepest recommendation is that we think New York City needs to create a food plan that charts 5 to 10 years of food policy goals for the city, state, and region. Someone once said, if you don't know where you're going, anywhere will take you there. And by lacking clear, quantifiable outcome goals, New York City has a very hard time tracking progress. We think that food plan has to be owned by government, civil society, the food business community, and others. And we think it's an important discussion about how to get from where we are, lacking such a food plan, but having the beginnings of a robust infrastructure, to having that plan and having it monitored. Second, we think we need to strengthen the food metrics process so that we track the goals that this food policy plan, the food plan, articulate. Third, we need to focus New York City food policies and programs on reducing inequalities in food-related outcomes and link it to other city equity initiatives. We've had a conversation with on some of these topics with Barbara Turk, and one of her suggestions, which I think is a good one, is to link a food plan to the One New York City, to the mayor's One New York City plan, to link food equity to housing equity, educational equity, employment equity. But we need to figure out how to do that and not to have it get lost in 67 different goals. Fourth, we believe that, again, the accomplishment of the last decade has been highlighting the public sector in food, institutional food, food standards, green cards, restaurant inspections, trans fat ban. But we think still too much the food activities of different city and state agencies and the federal government don't operate in tandem to use the public dollar and the public power to achieve public goals. And as a result, the elephant in the room, which is the food industry, sets so many of our food system goals. And their goals are not necessarily consistent with the well-being of New York City's population. We need to strengthen that public sector, just as we have in education and policing and transportation. Why shouldn't New York City lead the nation in having a strong food public sector? And why shouldn't we learn from cities and countries in other parts of the world that have done that? We need to create new democracy and governance processes that offer New Yorkers a greater voice in shaping their food environments. I've said in this room before, the closing of Pathmark on 125th Street and the opening of a Whole Foods across the street illustrates that the people of Harlem have no voice in shaping their food environment. The residents of Central and East Harlem did not decide to shut down Pathmark and did not decide to open Whole Foods. We should think about a way to give people who live here and in other New York City communities a voice. And finally, as researchers, we believe that researchers from other academic institutions and research institutions in New York need to come together and define a shared research agenda so that we work together to realize that, to fill in gaps in knowledge. We saw in the area of HIV, where many of us work, that bringing institutions together help to advance a research and policy agenda. Thank you very much, and now I really look forward to hearing the panel.
Okay, so I'd like to welcome our panelists to the stage. You guys can come on up and I'll announce you once you've had a seat. Wherever you'd like to sit. Okay, so first of all, thank you all for agreeing to participate in this panel. I think it'll be a lively discussion, and I'm looking forward to hearing some of your insights. To my immediate right is Dwayne Wharton. He's the Director of External Affairs for the Food Trust out of Philadelphia. For those of you who don't know, the Food Trust is involved with a wide range of food policy and programmatic initiatives and has really led the way on many, many things with respect to food policy and program work, particularly around healthy food financing initiatives and with food retail programming. Next to Dwayne is Council Member Mark Levine. He is the council member for the 7th District, Northern Manhattan, and is the current chair of the City Council's Health Committee. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to attend. And last, but definitely not least, is Kathy Nonas. She's a former senior advisor at the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene and had a front row seat to a lot of the most innovative food policy decisions that have been made over the last 10 years, and I'm excited to have her on the panel, and I know many of you are looking forward to hearing from her. So, and with that, I'm going to start with you, Kathy. From your experience as a former senior advisor on food policy and your long experience planning and implementing food programs and policies in NYC, what is your perspective on the greatest accomplishments and limitations of the last 10 years in food policy?
First, I have to congratulate you because this was a huge undertaking. And I have only been studying the mama bear part of it, and it has taken me way longer than 40 minutes to try to digest it. So I'm just warning all of you when you read this that it's going to take a number of reads before you are able to really comprehend everything that they've done. It's really a massive undertaking. So congratulations, no matter what I say. I think New York has been a very special case, and I was very lucky to have worked in an administration that was very supportive of food change and very, very gutsy. We had a mayor who was a public health mayor. We had a commissioner who was very good friends with the mayor. We had a city council that was very pro-food. So all of the things kind of aligned really well for us to begin to do things. And the hardest thing, I think, for populations to do is actually to inhibit people from doing something that we think is bad for their health. So although green cards and health bucks and everything are really important in terms of healthy food consumption, trying to stop people from eating too much salt, from eating trans fats, from drinking sugar-sweetened beverages is really difficult. So I think that the stars kind of aligned really well over those last 10 years. And we're struggling a bit now with a new government that really cares very deeply about equity and not necessarily about food, to figure out how we work within a new system that's a much kind of larger entity. So I just want to kind of put it out there. One thing that isn't in your thing is trans fats. And that was a very successful restriction of trans fats, the first in the country. And it was a very easy thing for other people to copy down the road. And it was really our first foray in kind of trying that medium to get a restriction. And it was really important in terms of health. So secondly, I think, many of us try to do things and we never know how they're going to succeed. So, we started with health bucks. We had $5,000 in the Bronx. And now it's, it's over $1 million. But the question is, how do we keep getting that kind of money? We're such a big organization, we're such a big city, we need more than that money in order to be able to go into supermarkets, to be able to give people the kind of opportunity to buy the fresh fruits and vegetables that they need. So that's the second bucket. And the third bucket is, for me, for success, is food standards, which I hated at the beginning. It was very, very specific to how many fruits and vegetables you should serve, how much your sodium is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That became a really important thing for two reasons. Not only did it change the way as city organizations we serve food, but it actually also, once we were able to do it, we could then go to the volunteer hospitals and other places and say, see, we did it here, this is how you negotiate a contract, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It was really important. And now, with the Trump administration, it's even more important, because it doesn't matter what they do in terms of food guidelines, because we have our own food guidelines, and we have to follow our own food guidelines, because that was a mayoral executive order. So I wish that other entities across the country had done the same, to be able to preserve their right to offer our school kids, our seniors, et cetera, the opportunity to really eat healthy no matter what the administration is doing. So I don't want to take too long. Those are the three successes. I have a list of limitations, but they're really just governmental limitations, so I'll let you go on.
And I think that your response really sets a great stage for my next question, which is directed at Mark. So in your view, what's the connection between health policy and food policy in New York City?
Well, more and more of the conditions that are topping the list of preventable diseases, from heart disease to diabetes to hypertension, are directly related to diet. So you cannot tackle public health in New York City or anywhere if you don't examine our diet. And as you rightly pointed out, these are tough times for winning any progress in Washington right now on food, where even in the best of times, corporate interests were distorting federal policy. But now it's harder than ever. The good news is that we do control local government still in this city and most cities in America, and we have huge potential to impact diet locally just with the tools that we control through local and state government. We have to start by leading by example. The city provides something like 250 million meals a year ourselves, 250 million meals and snacks. And if we're not doing that right, we can't lecture the private sector. We're doing this, of course, in the schools most famously, but in something like a dozen other agencies, from senior centers to child care settings to correctional facilities, mental health programs, homeless shelters, the courts. We are providing meals in the millions. Leadership in the last 10 years in defining new guidelines that limit the amount of salt in fried foods, increase the amount of vegetables, steer people to healthier beverages like skim milk and 1% milk. I think we're not at 100% on adherence to those guidelines yet amongst all the relevant agencies. We're getting there. I think we have to work more on that. You talked, Nick, about the more important question of what's actually being eaten, which is a separate question from what's on the menu. The fact that we now have free lunch in the schools and breakfast in the classroom should increase the numerator in that equation. I would think more kids are going to be eating what's being offered, but anecdotally we all know, and I see it in my kids, they retain the right to refuse to eat what's being served in the cafeterias and at home, I'm afraid. And we do face, I think, cultural barriers to kids eating healthy food, even if it's served. And so it has to be served in an appealing way, in a way that tastes good. I think the physical settings of the cafeteria needs to be examined. You want it to be a welcoming environment so kids don't opt to go out of the building where they have that option. A factor I didn't see in this report, which I think is relevant, is the lack of kosher and halal options in almost any public setting in New York City, which is an increasing need amongst students in the public schools and elsewhere. We've had some pilots where we've offered kosher and halal, for example, in the summer food programs for kids, and the take-up rate has been astronomical, but still it's very difficult to get kosher and halal food in any public setting right now, even in food kitchens for the most part. So we have to do better on that front. I'll just close by what I consider to be a success story in the effort for kids to want to eat healthy options, which is a great nonprofit I'm sure many of you know, which is Harlem Grown, led by the incredible Tony Hillary, which has taken half a dozen abandoned lots throughout Upper Manhattan and turned them into miniature farms where the kids are growing the food. And what they have learned is that when the kids grow the vegetables, it completely changes their relationship to the food, and that they are enthusiastically eating almost anything they grow because they know the entire history of the food, and they, with their own two hands, grew it, and sometimes we're involved in preparing it. What a powerful lesson that is. And, you know, we have something like, depending on how you count it, 600 community gardens throughout the city. And there is great work being done in many of them, but we really have barely tapped the potential of those properties for food production, but specifically for getting young people involved in food production, to say nothing of activating school roofs and so many other areas of the city. 14% of the surface area of the city is roof. rooftops. So huge potential for farming there. I think we can do more to creatively involve young people in the production and preparation of food in healthy ways that could yield huge benefits for their diet.
And I think both the response between you and Kathy really illustrated just in that 10-minute set of responses the range of food policy concerns that are at play in New York City. Everything from food standards to programmatic work to urban agriculture. And I think one of the other threads that was consistent between the two of you is that you talked about the role that New York City can play, under the current presidential administration in setting the tone for what's possible and not looking towards Washington to be either in fear or to get guidance from what we should do here. And with that in mind, I want to ask you, Dwayne. So Philadelphia has been a model of a city with a very active set of food policies. In your view, what are the lessons from Philly's experience that might be relevant to NYC?
Again, good morning, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation, Craig and Nick. So when I talked to my staff about coming up, they mentioned just the strong and long relationship that we've had with so many partners here in New York, and Kathy's name definitely came up. And I can share some of the...
Because you guys have stolen everything from me.
It's true. It's true. It's flattery. It's complimentary, for sure. And then it's funny, I was watching body language, so, Councilman, as you were speaking, there were some people who wanted to clap, but then they stopped and stuff. You can definitely clap, because it's so great to have someone who is in a position to help move these legislations, these policies forward, who gets it. So I hope you do clap, and I hope that you do support people who support the things that you care about. So in Philadelphia, we are, the fifth largest city, about 1.5 million people. We have big problems, high poverty, not necessarily a fluent tax base. Looking at SNAP participation being like a quarter of our population. So big problems. So we started 25 years ago, really out of trying to meet the need of lack of healthy food access in communities. So operating our first farmers market in cooperation with the Tenants Association at a public housing complex in South Philly. And from there, we grew our footprint and began working in schools, providing nutrition education and helping to change policies, getting fryers out, getting junk out of the vending machines, breakfast programs, free lunch expansion, et cetera. And we also have a Healthy Corner Store initiative, about 1,000 bodegas in the city. We're working with about 650 of them, trying to change the environment, using things like Heart Smarts that you have here, and Double Up Bucks at our farmers market. So lots of similar complementary and stolen programs that you've been working here in New York. The big thing that we're known for probably is our Fresh Food Financing Initiative, which the Fresh program was modeled after. Thank you. So it's so important to have good data and good reports. And, from some of the research that we did and looking at where there were poor communities and where there were not supermarkets and where there were heightened episodes of diabetes, hypertension, and obesity, we understood that there's a direct correlation between poor communities that don't have access to healthy food and early deaths related to it. So using that to spark conversations with policymakers and with public health advocates and the retail industry about why they aren't in these communities and what would it take to bring them to those communities. And there are lots of policy recommendations that came out of it, but the biggest was this Fresh Food Financing Initiative. So in Pennsylvania, we were able to garner $30 million from the state legislature. It was a very friendly legislature at the time. It's not now. The head of the Appropriations Committee was someone who actually, lived in a community that did not have access to a supermarket, so he got it. That was matched with lots of private capital, grown to $150 million, and grants and loans were made all across the state, not just in Philadelphia, to get supermarkets to open there. And that really, had a lot of multiple wins. So 500,000 people gained access, 5,000 jobs were created, and that model is looked at in 12 different states at this point. And sometimes we talk about health, and sometimes we talk about economic stimulation, sometimes we talk about jobs, and I think the lesson that I would like to talk about in Philadelphia is around the soda tax. So we passed it 2 years ago, but it was not from a health argument. It was about economic stimulation. It was about anti-poverty. And it was, the funds that were gained from the tax were used for 2,000 pre-K slots. So, we look at these big problems and poverty being the biggest. The way to break out of poverty is providing that foundational education for kids so that they can have better outcomes in life. So that was the argument. It wasn't about health. The interesting piece is that there was a broad coalition. So we had health advocates, we had the early pre-K advocates, we had the parks and rec and the library people because funds were used for that, and it passed. The other things we looked at is like, where are the other opportunities to impact these problems that we have in the city? So there's an equity in the building trade, where people of color have been historically left out. So tied to the initiative is like, the tax passes, city council approves it, but jobs have to be made on day one on work sites with people of color in them. Not a promise of a job in the future, not an apprenticeship program, but a paid living wage for those folks. So I definitely think that's noteworthy. There is an effort right now by the state to preempt our ability to tax ourselves in this way, to levy the tax against the distributor. Huge implications for that. So if it passes, if it moves forward, then they will take the ability for us to really self-govern. So in an environment where everyone talks about states' rights, no one wants cities to have rights. So it's just really interesting. There's tension in the industry as well. Talk about jobs being lost in the grocery retail industry. Our role in supporting the development of retail is challenged because we are supportive of a tax. So we're looking to recapitalize lots of fresh food financing and move that forward across the country. But, we're struggling in some places where they want us to justify why we are supporting the tax. So it's like lots of things to talk about there. Two quick things around retail. We have a nuisance bar ordinance that just passed at the city and then supported at the state level, so that establishments that sell beer have to take down the glass, and they actually have to provide seating. So it just removes this kind of issue around people loitering and just using it for lots of kind of insidious practices, which is really interesting. And then we have an effort to reduce sodium in our takeout restaurants as well, specifically working with Chinese food store owners to take down the salt, and we want to see health improvements around hypertension in the city.
Great. Thank you. That's quite a lot, and I think that many of the things you mentioned are complementary.
Thank you.
Your timing was off. You waited until I got started. You stepped on my line. A lot of the items you talked about were very complementary to some of the things that have been done here in New York and also in Baltimore as well. So you guys kind of have gotten the best of both worlds. A lot of the work that's come out of Johns Hopkins with Joel Gittleson, really pioneered some of the more innovative retail interventions. And what I hear in your description really is a kind of, again, the best mix of both innovative things in Philly and ideas from New York and Baltimore that really kind of,
Before you ask the next question, can I just
absolutely.
two things. One is, and I think it's really important, I thought when you passed the tax, and one of the reasons the tax was passed is because of all the people who kind of had failed to get their tax passed, but it became something that people were used to thinking about. And I always think of Maine because they're oftentimes the ones that start something and they never get it passed. But they are the ones that put the kind of bug in our head. So I just want to say to everybody that even if we fail at certain things, it still creates that kind of bug. And the second thing is what we should be doing, you and New York and Baltimore, is we should be thinking of that northeast corridor and how we can get fruits and vegetables and other things in a cheaper way to the bodegas and others that we're working with, because we never really work together like that. So.
Yeah. I saw in your report you had indications of 2 food distribution points. I'd be one in the Bronx, another in a place I didn't recognize. But yeah, I'd be really interested in that as well. Yeah.
Because We've been trying to do this for a long time.
Yeah, the distribution has always been a really sort of appealing point of entry from food policy perspective, but there's all sorts of issues at play that make it very difficult, particularly, the last mile delivery issue, which Dennis, who's in the audience, can speak to that a little bit later if he wants to ask a question. So Kathy, to what extent do you agree or disagree with the key findings in the report? What do you think we overlooked? You talked about trans fats, which I think we didn't have because of the time in which it got implemented. It didn't fit within the 10-year period that we were looking at. Not that we didn't obviously think that it's important, but beyond that, what are the sorts of things that you were missing, and what are your general thoughts on the findings?
First, I really tried really hard to kind of think this through. It's really, as I said, a really thoughtful kind of policy report. I think obviously we've leaned very heavily on government in New York City, and now we can't so much, and so we really do have to think better about how we not only reach out to public areas, but that the public really kind of takes the ownership of it and leads government, maybe. Money is a really important piece. I mean, we're fighting for money. Does money go to food? Does it go to education? Does it go to health care? I mean, where is that money coming from? Because all of this stuff takes money. I know I'm going to depress everybody, but... and then I think the limitations of our own minds. It's very hard to think imaginatively. When we tried to restrict portion size of sugar-sweetened beverages, it was the shot that was heard around the world. I mean, it was such a crazy thing. We could never have paid for that kind of promotion and everything. And I do believe it made taxes seem much more tame. And so I think we need to think about that, and we need people with great courage to be able to, say things and advertise it and get people behind it, the public behind it. So that's one of the things. And I'm just going to say one more thing, because I actually have a laundry list of kind of limitations and concerns. I think we've been wrong about the way in which we've evaluated our food programs in terms of obesity and diabetes. I came to the health department because of my significant experience in obesity and diabetes. But that's a long-term thing. You can cut soda, but that doesn't mean that you're going to change obesity statistics. And when I think we need to put a lot more emphasis on preventing weight gain in our children, because that's going to be when they become adults, that's when we're going to be able to see that potential change. So, for instance, when we've sold supermarkets in New York City, getting supermarkets in low-income areas, we've actually sold it as an obesity and diabetes improvement effort. And then when people have evaluated the effect of it, they've said, well, there's no change in obesity or diabetes. Well, the truth is, how could there have been? I mean, just because there's a supermarket doesn't mean that people change the way that they eat. Just because there's a supermarket and they eat better doesn't mean that they're not also eating other things as well. I think we put ourselves in kind of a hole, and I think evaluators put themselves in a hole when they try to get money for research, and they're looking at short-term changes in obesity because the supermarket came. And I want you to know that Brian Elbel, who's not here, is an NYU researcher who has always driven me crazy because he's always done these type of evaluations. So he and I tried to actually write a paper on how we think researchers should evaluate public health changes. We've gotten it rejected from everything, but if anybody, but because it's a very hard thing to do, but it's important to think about in terms of how we evaluate short-term effects versus long-term effects.
Thank you. And, you know, with that in mind, Mark, in your role as new chair for the Health Committee, what might be some of the areas of sort of food health nexus where the City Council may focus their efforts in the next 4 years?
Well, we've read a lot about all the aspects of policy which we don't control in city government because either the state preempts us or it's a federal issue, but the one area where we have unambiguous control is in real estate and zoning. And it seems like real estate is at the heart of every challenge we're facing in New York City today, and that is true of food policy as well. And while I don't minimize the role of choice and the need for all of us to own up to personal responsibility to eat well, the reality is it is more expensive and less convenient to obtain healthy food in New York City for almost everybody. Almost everybody. You know, I walk into any bodega in my district and there's almost no way to walk out with something healthy. Everything is either high sugar, high fat, high salt, or all three. And we already faced enormous disparity in the availability of supermarkets and green grocers, disparity between high-income neighborhoods and low-income communities of color in this city. Traditionally, the industry likes to have 30,000 square feet of supermarket for every 10,000 residents. And we're at half that in most low-income parts of the city, including West Harlem and Washington Heights and the South Bronx and in many similar places. And we are now experiencing head-spinning changes in the retail landscape in New York City, which I don't think we're adequately grappling with as policymakers. Where we're seeing the rapid loss of supermarkets all over the city, in Chelsea and in Washington Heights, because of rising rents and the determination that landlords have made that they can make more money with other retail uses. Now, that's bad in Chelsea, but in Washington Heights, we're already suffering with inadequate supply. So the impact there is more serious. And at the same time, the supermarkets which are expanding are high-end. And yes, they do have healthier options, thankfully, but they're very expensive. And you're finding, because of the forces of gentrification, low-income people who have managed to survive the threat to their housing costs and have avoided displacement are increasingly finding themselves in neighborhoods where there are no affordable food options, certainly no healthy, affordable food options. So I think we need to look at the power of our zoning code, among other things, and the millions of dollars of city subsidies that we're putting into real estate development and start to try and guarantee that affordable, healthy food options emerge. There's been some... All right, thank you. And there have been some interesting things done on zoning that on the Upper West Side where they limited the size of storefronts for everything except supermarkets, and even more severely restricted the size of storefronts for banks. And that's the kind of thing we probably need to be doing everywhere, where we're changing the equation for retail in a way that favors supermarkets. Increasingly, New Yorkers are getting their food from chain pharmacies. This is an incredible development that I don't think any of us foresaw 10 years ago. I wouldn't have dreamed of seeking groceries from a Rite Aid 10 years ago. But increasingly, that's what is taking over our retail landscape. And they are overwhelmingly skewed to packaged foods, overwhelmingly, which are almost always the least healthiest, because I guess of their supply chain. I don't know the dynamics there, but that is a very frightening development from the perspective of our diet. So what can we do to limit the proliferation of chain drugstores, or alternatively determine what they're selling and make sure they're giving us healthier options? And I fully support bodegas and small businesses, the ultimate kind of mom and pop stores that are so much a part of the cultural landscape in all of our communities. But in my local bodega where I live on 162nd Street, I have to go 8 freezers in to find a diet soda, and then it's on one little rack. And I think we need to examine policies that can help encourage what are really the frontline providers of food to offer more options in a way that are accessible and visible and attractive.
Can I cut him off for just a second? I'm so sorry, but I'm so excited. And I'm not in city government, so I can say anything anymore. And maybe we're going to say the same thing. But I was, after the head of Ag and Markets here in New York State for a long time, to either call Duane Reade and CVS supermarkets and to change what is a supermarket so that either they have to have a lot more perishable food or else they have to take the junk out of their pharmacies because they can afford rent that supermarkets can't because of the perishable piece. So if you guys know the head of Ag and Markets, if you guys can make a big deal about this, this would really change the landscape. And also the dollar stores. Both those things would be great.
Yeah. And to piggyback, that's exactly what I wanted to talk about.
Copying me.
Yeah, the whole notion of food swamps, right? The proliferation of unhealthy food is just a broken model. And what's really troubling is that, we work around the country and then largely in cities, but there's plenty of rural communities that have to depend on like Dollar Tree for food. And Minneapolis tried to enact like a staple food ordinance, which basically said, they had a requirement around produce and low-fat milk and grains, et cetera, in stores, like a healthy retail model. And they applied it, I think, in 2008, and then revisited it again like in 2014 and gave a grace period for stores to comply. And then they enacted it, and they're having pretty high compliance. But Dollar Tree specifically said that because of their model to keep everything at $1, they rely on weekly shipments and distribution to come to their stores, and that doesn't work for fresh food. So they refuse to participate to the point where they refuse to take SNAP dollars and SNAP benefits from customers. So that just creates a whole other set of problems for our communities. So we really have to rethink and how to get some of these big players to kind of change their model and think about ways that they can improve community health.
So I think in the interest of time, we're going to open up the floor for some questions. If you are interested in asking a question, just raise your hand and we'll get to you. What we'll do, we'll take 2 or 3 questions at a time and then allow the folks to respond. So does anyone have any questions?
Great comment so far. I was wondering whether, from the policy perspective, that any effort was being put in to pair up food policy with programs that emphasize exercise, because calories in and calories out do matter, and you might gain some momentum there.
So we have an initiative that's abroad. It's interesting. So we don't have a large food policy comprehensive plan, but we do have kind of this larger Department of Health plan called Get Healthy Philly. And in it, it's food and it's physical activity and it's actually smoking cessation. So largely, it's an in-school, out-of-school, after-school, community-based program where all the things are happening, nutrition, education, and changing school policies, et cetera. But also the corner stores are tied to it and the farmers markets are tied to it. But the youth, so they're the ones who are kind of now engaged in like leading movement breaks, and there's ensuring that there's more physical activity in schools, et cetera. So under the Get Healthy Philly initiative, we try to combine it all together. And we've actually seen reductions in obesity rates in the city. So it's like a 7% decrease overall, like 6.3. And the biggest changes have happened with African-American boys and Asian boys as well, but for particularly African-American boys has been a hard population to see progress in, so we're happy where that's headed. We aren't seeing as much gains in, say, Hispanic girls, but we do think that the benefits are because of this comprehensive approach that does combine the two.
Hello, I'm actually visiting from Toronto. I'm Joe Nasser, and this is maybe as much as anything for the team behind this report. And in particular, Nick mentioned 160 some recommendations that have 420. Okay, even more. So and the issue of how do you kind of weed through a lot of sensible recommendations to come up with the priorities. I mean, we run into the same problem in Toronto. I was involved for urban agriculture in an action plan with like 45 recommendations or actions that we recommend and so on. But now we're really realizing is that we kind of stopped short of going from that to figuring out which are the priorities. And so the process to get from the mass of recommendations to the priorities. Words of wisdom from New York or Philly.
Thank you. Actually, kind of in line with that question, one of the recommendations was about new democracy and government processes that offer New Yorkers greater voice. And I think when people talk about this, they often talk about the responsibility of individual citizens to step up and get engaged and speak up. And I'm particularly interested in what role our local government can play in supporting this and creating space for it, whether it's processes like participatory budgeting or being thoughtful about when hearings are being held, offering childcare. Like there's a lot of different levers that our government can play to really support this particular recommendation, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Good morning. So I have 3 different comments. One is related to the Northeast region and looking at different connections. I'd like to see and suggest that you also look at connecting Region 2 under the Department of Health and Human Services, because they do look at New York, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. And since there's so many populations in New York that are from those communities, helping to look at how we talk and educate to people in New York City. The second is looking at, I'm pre-diabetic, and my mom passed away about a year ago being diabetic. And what I found is not enough people focus on talking about prediabetes. So when we're talking about prevention, I notice in a number of reports, even with doctors, they always focus on diabetes, but don't really focus on prevention and looking at that population that are pre-diabetic, so you can help people to really begin to understand what that means and what that looks like. And the last thing is, I'm from the office of Councilmember Inez Barron. I'm the legislative director. And so one of the things I asked the councilmember we've been looking to do is to come up with a bill that's similar to, I know most people are familiar with the choking bill, that poster that you see in restaurants. So we were thinking that maybe there would be a way to actually create a poster that educates people around carbs. And what we did find and came back from the Department of Health is it's kind of hard to measure. The best thing that they can measure with sugar things are looking at drinks. So I've been, meeting and having conversations, and we're open to seeing, of course, partnering with Councilmember Mark Levine, what that actually poster can look like, because we do find that people are just very ignorant about what they should eat. So it's not telling people not to eat something, but it's really at least giving them the tools to say, if you have that toast or if you have that muffin or something, that, the carbs and the risk of it are great.
first question was about how the 420 recommendations were, aggregated and used in order to think about, what sort of priorities should be put in place. The second was dealing with how, community members might be able to engage more readily with the different government processes around legislation and giving their input. And the last was kind of a three-part. You talked, I think the primary two were common, and one was really a question about how you would implement these sort of posters, and what would they look like? How would you roll that out, and what would be the best strategy for giving people health information in restaurants? So, would like to respond to one of those questions first.
I'd like to say a word on the democratization question, and I'm so glad you brought up participatory budgeting. For those who don't know, this is a program that has really been taking off in the New York City Council. Now close to 30 council members are participating, and we are each turning over at least $1 million in capital money to a community-led democratic decision-making process where members of the residents of the district nominate, essentially campaign for, and then ultimately vote on various capital projects in their district. And it's been fascinating to see, at least in my district, how many of the projects relate to food. And it's totally organic. We don't determine what's nominated. We just give people the opportunity to organize and wait and see what comes back. But we've had projects nominated, a number of rooftop gardens at schools. We had hydroponic equipment for growing inside school buildings. And one of my favorites by another great nonprofit uptown, which is one I know many of you know, Brotherhood Sister Soul, where young people there, and I should mention that people 14 and over are able to vote in this process, so there's a real inclusion of young men and women in the voting. And by the way, you also don't have to be a citizen or even a legal resident. As long as you can prove residence in the community, your documentation status doesn't matter. Anyway, so young people at Brother and Sister Soul nominated a project to build a greenhouse on an adjacent community garden, and that project actually won. And so they got, I don't know what it was, $50,000 or $60,000 in city capital money to do this. To me, it's very hopeful to see that the public and activists are thinking about this. And it's also a reminder that you do need some infrastructure to ensure that healthy food is created and distributed here in New York City, and that it probably shouldn't only be left to participatory budgeting, because some of these projects are very big tickets, very big ticket items. But it is one small, powerful way in which we can bring the public in, give them the power, and trust that they're going to do the right thing, which they have in our district at least.
So, Kathy, could you respond to the question about health messaging in restaurants? I know we've had this discussion before, and I think you have some interesting perspectives on this. So.
We were the ones that had the calories attached to the menu boards in chain restaurants, thinking that kind of information would be useful to people. And in fact, it was useful for some of the people, and it was probably, nobody's done that evaluation recently, but it was probably, my guess is that it was probably more useful at the beginning than it is now. But we also found that it didn't necessarily resonate in every ethnic group, every age group, et cetera. So probably the people who were most interested in it from the research studies were white women. And so that information didn't do exactly what we were hoping it would do. We also hoped that it would change the formulations of certain of the food, and it did, but not to the extent that we had hoped. That's not to say that you shouldn't put information in there, and certainly now we have salt shakers and stuff to show you how much sodium it is. It's just to say that it's very hard to think of a way to put something that will resonate for all groups in all neighborhoods, and that they'll actually read it. So I like your idea, although I think I'm glad I'm not at the Department of Health anymore, because I don't think the restaurants would take anything more from us. But I'm not sure how to do it.
And I wanted to, for the question about the 420 recommendations and priorities, I wanted to sort of split the response between Dwayne and Nick. And I know you participate in the Food Policy Council in Philadelphia, and I was wondering if you can share with us how that council goes about setting priorities for the sort of things that they're interested in.
It's a hot mess. So the Office of Sustainability is under the mayor, and they have a Green Works initiative, which covers like 8 different things. And then it's like increasing healthy food access and safe water as one of them. And then they say this is achieved through the Food Policy Council, which is appointed members from all different walks of life, and we're increasing our diversity and representation of community. And then, you know, we've done some reports and we've done some good work. And then there are like 6 subcommittees, and we created the health committee when I came on because there was no room for like soda tax, there was no room for like safe water, there was no room to talk about breastfeeding, which I didn't see in your report, as, you know, key food things that we should be looking at. So we created it, and we set a bunch of priorities based on conversations with the health department. What are your priorities? What are you working on? How can we support things that are in concert with what we think are important as well as a committee? We also fielded, you know, from the public kind of their things that they wanted to work on. And then we looked at kind of some of the national policy efforts that are happening, like with the Voices for Healthy Kids initiative, which is looking at lots of policy efforts around obesity reduction. And we came up with about 12 things we're working on this year. But then there are like 6 other committees. I'm like, oh, wait a minute. Well, Hunger's working on fresh food financing. That's actually something that we should be doing. And my food trust hat, we're leading. So it doesn't necessarily line up. And, you know, we need to have more concerted effort. And again, I shared this with the Food Policy Council, your report, as well as with the health department, because I think it could help us think about how to be more synergistic in our work.
I think there's a lot of lessons in what you said for New York City, depending on, you know, how we move forward with a food plan or any sort of, you know, increasing the food democracy in New York City. So, Nick, do you want to talk a little bit about the 420 recommendations and what we were thinking as far as priorities?
So I think, as I understood your question, and thank you for it, is so how do we move forward? You know, how do we go from 420 to something that is manageable? And I think we've thought a lot about it, and I think we really invite people to think about it and talk to us, and we really think this is the time to put a concrete recommendation on the table. And Kathy, I really agree that this is some time for thinking out of the box, you know, and that we need to be innovative. And as I've thought about it, I think of 3 different organizational forms that we need to integrate in some new way. One is a oversight body that already exists. I think the Board of Health is one example. The Board of Corrections in New York City that oversees the city jails is another example. Bodies that are quasi-independent of city government and have expertise and community roots and make determinations about how to do. I think that's one body of experience. I think the second is community level experience. Community boards, which I think have contributed a lot, but also are prone to bureaucracy and to turf fights within communities. I know City Harvest has done some very nice, I think, local food policy councils. There's one in my neighborhood in Washington Heights and some in other parts of the city. I think having local food policy councils that can bring their thoughts up to a higher, you know, to other levels of government and the public. And then I think the third characteristic is really social movements. I think about the movement that forced City University to implement open admissions in the 60s. I think about the movement that recently persuaded the city to close down Rikers Island. And so I think we need to come up with a new form that puts together those oversight bodies, the community level, and the social movement level. And I really invite all of you to think about how can we do that. And wouldn't it be great if we could get together a year from now and say we've created a process to develop a food plan that will be inside of city government and outside of city government, and that will set the goals for New York City to achieve. That's where we hope to go, and we really want to do that with all of you and with the City Council and the Mayor and with other cities to learn from your experiences and your successes and failures.
Great. So I think that's a good place to leave it. I want to thank all of my panelists. Really great discussion, and we appreciate, again, you taking the time out to come and, share your thoughts and to help us think through what food policy has been, is currently, and what it could look like in the next 10 years. And thank you for everyone for coming today. Also, just another plug for our report. You can download it on our website. It's under the publications section. Additionally, for those of you who are getting our newsletter, it came in our newsletter yesterday. And lastly, the first part of the report, the food governance in New York City, that looked at food governance over the last 10 years, is an integral part of understanding the overall food policy landscape in New York City. And I urge you to, if you're interested in this topic, to read that report. Thank you.